Hi, Misha here, and honestly I just felt like doing a Star Trek video, and still kind of doing with a new camera. And I thought this would be a little different. Look at the various ships, kind of based on the Galaxy class, so the first half or so of the 24th century. And in this video, I thought I would be more imaginative. And let me explain. Back 20 years ago, when I was in college, of course, people played video games as they do today, but of course, I really couldn't do that. So what I did do was I edited modified games. And one game that was very easy to modify, add craft to, etc., was Star Trek Armada and Star Trek Armada 2. And so I made various mods, patches, and upgrades, mostly adding all the Canon ships I could to it, and then my friends could play it. And that's how I was able to kind of interact with them and have fun. So in this video, I thought I would kind of talk about these vessels in a certain manner that I would have probably added them to the game, or just, headcanon type stuff. And also just some fun bullshit type things, jokes and whatnot. So I don't know, just gonna ramble and talk about each of these ships, from the earliest ones in the lineage, like the Ambassadors, through the Wolf 359 ships, through the Nebula variants, and in with the Galaxies. And of course, these are all die-cast from Eagle Moss. This collection is over with 180 issues, but they're doing newer collections now that I haven't really gotten into yet. So yeah, just kind of hanging out, shooting the shit. So if you'd like to do that with me, stay tuned. Ever since I first knew about this ship, thanks to models, I've always liked the Ambassador. Of course, we first saw this on screen in Season 3 of Next Generation, but in universe, it's really the first of the 24th century ships, supposedly made with newer computer systems, kind of getting away from the previous Constitution and Excelsior mindset. Although, in an effort to kind of make a lineage happen, they made the nacelles look like a combination between the Enterprise A and the Enterprise D. And the deflector dish is obviously very Enterprise A, but it has more patterning like a D. And the saucer is very round, but it does have partial phaser strips. In universe, this is said to be a little more combat oriented than maybe some previous Starfleet ships. And it was pretty much the premier frontline heavy cruiser from around 23, 25 up to the time of the Galaxy class, say 2365. But they were still making them in numbers, at least limited numbers, during the Dominion War. And we see a decent number throughout the series in a few different variations. It's a relatively big ship, about 550 meters, crew of around 700, and it's decently combat capable, because even in yesterday's Enterprise, it's considered to be a good combat ship, if not excellent. So we know it was pretty modern. This design is kind of a love it or hate it thing. It's amazing how quickly they actually made it for the show, slapped it together on a very low budget. That explains why it originally had some oversights, like not having impulse engines clearly defined in the back, and looking more like the Enterprise A than I think they originally intended to be, more of a basics shape. In a video game setting, this would be a good early battleship, tough and durable, decent firepower, but nothing fancy or modern, maybe weaker shields. This kind of a old, reliable second-line ship. You saw that a lot in World War II. There'd be some older World War I era battleships that were retrofit and upgraded to try to make them modern with limited success, and that's what this could be. But it kind of set the design tone in universe there. I think it's a lot of people's favorites, although it does get some criticism. And here we have the Andrew Probert Concept Enterprise C. This was originally kind of shown in paintings and maybe small miniatures at the beginning of Next Generation. It was meant to be the C. It's definitely more like the Excelsior with the long, thin nacelles. This is kind of the stretched star drive, but also trending towards the Enterprise D with a somewhat ovular shaped saucer, and certainly in the deflector and kind of cut of the star drive. It actually looks very modern. Even looks maybe like something that would honestly be between the Enterprise D and the Enterprise E, based on how the E looks. So it has a very modern look for this era. Also looks pretty powerful, fast. We don't really have any canon information about this. We could easily say that it was a series of prototypes or whatever, limited production ships. It does seem to exist in universe because, again, we've seen drawings and pictures and things of them. But I think in a game setting, this could be kind of the next step up. It's certainly a heavy cruiser. Maybe something a little on the fast side, well armed, maybe a little weak on defense. Again, it's something in limited use, but it's been floating around the Star Trek universe since early Next Generation. The reason they didn't actually make this as a model for yesterday's Enterprise was because it was honestly too difficult and time-consuming to build on a small budget with limited time. Too many angles and unique parts. So they went with the easier-to-make Enterprise C we know and love. So yeah, it's really neat that Eagle Moss did this one. This wasn't in their standard series. This was in their special or bonus editions that you bought separately. It's a good size, though. Next up, the Niagara class. I remember this one clearly from the old Armada days because it took me a long time to find a model to include in the game. They were, 3D files that were pre-made. I wasn't very good at making 3D models for some reason. I could easily find the Ambassador, at least the original, not the prototype one. But yeah, it took me a bit to find a Niagara. And this was actually based on the Ambassador. The nacelles are more like an Enterprise D style. But the star drive is very much Ambassador. And the saucer is kind of a combination of the two. Looks mostly like an Enterprise D, but it does have some elements like the older Ambassador, including the limited phaser strips. In the universe, this came a little bit later, in, say, the 2340s. And so it was probably used during the Cardassian border wars, which were in the 2350s. It was kind of touted as a frigate and kind of a fast response vehicle because of the 3 nacelles, medium range. It is said to have a pretty good stock of photon torpedoes, about 160. And it's supposed to have had new technology, including, like I said, the new nacelles. It had pretty high warp, but it also had some problems testing out the new tech, so in a game environment, I would definitely make this a fast response ship, a picket ship, if you will, a patrol ship. because it's kind of a blending of technologies that would have maybe older shielding but newer type engines, maybe older phasers but be heavy on the photon torpedoes, so maybe a torpedo, like a torpedo boat, but mostly its thing would be fast and tough engines. Also could be quick transport for passengers, or response to a colonial emergency type ship. It's a neat design though. Of course this was in the Wolf 359 graveyard scene, and it's really kind of adds to the lineage of the Ambassador. It's what I've always liked. We don't get too many 3 nacelled ships, and what's kind of neat about the way they did this, the line of sight thing is kept. Although I've often thought this would kind of be a neat ship without the lower nacelle. Then it would just look like a slightly improved Ambassador. It's always fun when they start sticking nacelles in weird places, because it's a good way to visually on screen ID a different ship. The Narlands class. This was kind of overlooked in the early days. Often just touted as a scaled down Galaxy with the low screen caps res of the day. I think that's what a lot of us thought of it as. In fact, when I did the game, I just scaled down a Galaxy model and used it for that. And while at some angles it certainly is, at other angles, nah, it's its own thing. In universe, this is said to be a prototype, or kind of, at least for the technology, prototype of the Galaxy. It uses the same nacelles, but of course they're scaled up, because this is a smaller ship. It's not tiny, it's about 450, maybe 500 meters, so it's a little bit shorter than an Ambassador, but it's wider thanks to the ovular saucer, and it has a crew of about 500 to 550. It also has these pods on top, 2 on top and 2 on bottom. In universe, these are said to be photon torpedo launchers, each that held 100 torpedoes and could launch forward or aft. And of course they could be replaced with cargo pods or sensor pods, whatever. It kind of shows the beginning of the whole pod thing. It has a Enterprise style deflector, but no real neck to speak of. And the pylons are interesting for the nacelles. They're kind of a combination of the D and the A style. The saucer is very much like the Galaxy, except it's got a larger bridge to try to make the scale look different. And I think they added these pods in the real world just to distinguish this from other ships a little more. But this was supposed to be one of the front line, say, medium cruisers or heavy frigates during the Cardassian border wars. Kind of one of the outpost response. It had pretty high warp, not quite as high as the Galaxy, but still pretty good. And again, defense-wise, it had the pods. So in a game environment, this would be a good one to make a flexible ship that you could kind of configure for different things. Also, kind of a tough little ship type thing. I would expect it to have pretty good shields and armor, and like I said, pretty good warp. This is when they're testing the newer systems. This is kind of the next step, the next iteration after the Ambassadors. They're getting into the technologies that would ultimately form the Galaxies here. And these are still very much in service during the 2360s. They seem to have come into service in the 2340s. It's also worth pointing out that O'Brien served on the Rutledge, which is said to be a New Orleans class. At least I like to think so. During the Cardassian Wars. Unfortunately, we don't really get a lot of these, and again, it was kind of an overlooked kit bash for a lot of time, but it's getting attention now, and I was really happy that they did this for Eagle Moss, because it's a neat design. I really like it. Next up, the Freedom class. This is a love it or hate it ship, and I love it. I always have. It's also the only on-screen single nacelle ship, as far as I know. This is kind of another blending of old and new tech. It has a Galaxy-style nacelle with a teeny tiny deflector underneath it. And then it has a saucer that's kind of reminiscent of the Ambassador, the Galaxy, and even the Constitution combined, with partial phaser strips. And it also has a phaser cannon on the underside. Some might call this a sensor. They would be wrong. But it makes sense. This is a relatively small ship. Obviously, no redundancy in the warp because of one nacelle. You're under 400 meters, with a lot of that being the nacelle hanging out the back. Probably a relatively small crew, maybe 300. And the reason I like this, well, you have some Constitution elements, like the neck is certainly a Connie, which means you also have photon torpedo launchers there. So she's pretty well armed for her size. Phaser strips, one phaser cannon, 2 torpedo launchers. So I like the Connie elements, but I also like that it's reminiscent of the original Scout and Destroyer classes from the 1980s, like the FASA stuff. Because single nacelle ships have been in that for a long time. And it does seem like it's in that Scout and Destroyer type role. So call it a patrol ship, a policing ship, kind of a cutter to patrol borders, maybe go after Orion pirates or something. And basically just have a little ship to zoom around as needed. Not at super high warp, but still has a modern nacelle, so you know you're looking probably warp 9, top speed, maybe cruise warp 6. Probably not a deep space, long duration. I would consider this a light cruiser or a frigate type. Probably could be one to visit colonies and provide security for whatever area in space, because despite what one would think, the Federation is not wholly at peace. There are pirates, there are bad things afoot. In a game setting, this would definitely be a lighter craft, a destroyer type, probably relatively inexpensive to build, not requiring a lot of crew, decent offensive firepower for its cost and size. But with only one nacelle, it could easily be knocked out. And yeah. So yeah, it's always good to have little units. This would be a good one you could spam in a video game. Next up, the Challenger. Next up, the Cheyenne class. And this is a different look. This looks like it's built for speed and to deliver a punch too. I don't know why, but these pieces here, they look like they would be weapons arrays, photon launchers. There's one on top, one on bottom. Of course, having 4 nacelles would lend speed in long range, but also the way the saucer is done. It's bulgy in the middle, but also very thin on the edge. Of course, the real reason is they used the 2 same halves of a Galaxy class to make the saucer when they did the model, but in universe it gives it a unique saucer look, kind of thin and knife-like. It looks like a high-speed, deep space, medium cruiser, maybe heavy frigate This would be one that you could send in. It would have good engines, both durable and fast. Probably could deliver a decent punch. Probably had newer technology. Looks kind of modern-y with the nacelles. But maybe a little finicky, a little temperamental as far as keeping it running. I don't know, it's always neat to have a 4 nacelle ship. No real deflector on these, which is kind of interesting. Pretty good size little model too. And certainly adds to the fleet. Not much to say about it because we really don't know anything about it aside from it appeared in the wreckage. But it would definitely look good in game just because it's different looking, including using different nacelles. A different looking saucer. So even though this is a kit bash, the way they did it, it ends up looking very distinctive. So yeah, a good support ship, good rapid response. Probably, like I said, a good medium deep space explorer craft as well. Moving right along, we get to the Springfield class. And this is a hard one to pin down. It has similar looking nacelles to our Cheyenne, so it's probably from the same period. But only 2 of them. We have this large pod on the top, which presumably is interchangeable. And then we have a star drive, like a galaxy on the bottom. But then it has these 2 struts that go into the saucer to connect it. In a way, it kind of reminds me of an upside-down flipped Miranda. Because the Miranda has that roll bar. This is like an upside-down roll bar. It ends up being your deflector. And then our nacelles are just kind of branched off the back of this extension, kind of like the Challenger. And then, yeah, then we have a pod we could potentially use as a cargo pod or replace it with a weapons pod or whatever. To my mind, this would be a medium cruiser, kind of analogous to the Miranda. Average size, 400 to 450 meters. It looks like a workship used for science, patrol, medium range exploration. But it also does seem to be an older ship because, again, the nacelles are kind of that transitory style. But it seems to be a companion to the Cheyenne. If the Cheyenne's the rapid response craft that maybe has limited cargo space, this would be the somewhat slower but heavier lifting version. Doesn't seem to be terribly combat oriented though. So yeah, I'd probably make this a versatile ship because of the pod. Reasonable speed, but nothing special. And, you know, maybe it could be a freighter or a repair ship. It actually looked like a bit, you know, if you had the pod on it, it'd be a kind of a nice little repair support ship. But it just seems like an average Starfleet ship. Again, very much analogous to a Miranda. Just something that does all this work inside the Federation and maybe very briefly goes outside of it to do missions, but not a frontline combat ship and probably not a long-range explorer ship. Just doesn't have that vibe to me. That's kind of the point of this video, just talking about my perceptions for fun. I do like it though. It's kind of hard to pin down. It doesn't have any super distinguishing features. It definitely has a galaxy vibe, but the way the nacelles are above the saucer is reminiscent of the old Constitution. I don't know. It's just kind of its own thing. Hard to pin down, but still very neat. And now we come to the Nebula variants. This is the Melbourne type, the first one we ever saw. And yeah, it does have a lot in common with the Springfield in a lot of ways. the way the shape of the star drive is made, and the kind of the pylons for the nacelles, but they angle down instead of up, and that leaves room on top for something. Now, interestingly, the first time we ever saw this on screen, the graveyard scene, it had these two little bitty nacelles. I don't really know. They seem to be part of a pod system or something for it. So it's either carrying these nacelles for something else, or they're there for backup, which is kind of odd. But it's unique looking, I give it that. And this is truly the successor to the Miranda. If the Galaxy is analogous to the Constitution, this is analogous to the Miranda type. And in the games, this was used as a special science ship that was configurable with different weapons, and I think that's exactly right. Because of the pod system, you could put different pods on it. I guess this one you could call a warp pod for both extra power and speed. It's also possible these could be detachable and attached to, say, a Galaxy-class saucer stranded in space. In the universe, this is considered a medium cruiser, solidly so. Crew of around 700-800. Overall length, about 450. But it's very compact, so it's a little more internal volume than you would figure. But it's kind of the do-all ship, the mainstay, honestly. And it seems to have come into service right around the same time as the Galaxy, give or take. So it's a very up-to-date technology, very capable. We see in the show that, yeah, it works well. This is just an interesting little variant. We also see this model used literally as a model in Deep Space Nine and on some displays, so it's obviously a common configuration. This was also the most recent one Eaglemoss did, and probably their best work. But it's neat, and certainly fits that medium cruiser role very well. And we have, sorry, I think I had you angled. And we have several to talk about here. But I think it's a worthy successor to the Springfield, which, you know, kind of, I don't know, I like how there's a certain lineage and obvious design purpose. Even though it's fiction, it fits well. It shows some forethought, even if it's maybe accidental. And now for another variant. This is the Phoenix variant, the one we really see up close and functional in Season 4. And it has what many refer to as an AWACS pod, a high bandwidth sensor pod on the back. And this really illustrates something that Eaglemoss did that was neat. This is an all-new tooling. You would expect them just to use the same one, replacing the pod in the back. But actually, it's a different shape to the star drive, which is correct. It's more squared off versus the Melbourne, which again was some people call the prototype Nebula. And the mount is a little bit different back here too, and the way the saucer extends back. Yeah, it's a different shape overall, which I really appreciate. Looking behind the bridge here, even that's a little bit different shaped. Yep, this would be more of a science or detection type thing. Certainly fitting a role, but more in a support role, just like an AWACS. You know, an AWACS doesn't really have any weapons, although this does, but it coordinates defense and offense, and I could see this as being a very instrumental part. Also a good border patrol ship for detecting things. But yeah, we can tell from the episode it's in, The Wounded, that this is still a powerful ship, at least compared to Kardashians. This was Eaglemoss's second effort, and it's quite good. Has a few flaws, but overall, very nice. I think a lot of us like the Nebula. It's just that good understated workaday ship. And our third Nebula variant, although this was the first one Eaglemoss did, the Farragut or the Haju type. We mostly see this later on. It's very similar to the Phoenix, although a little bit different in the back again, especially with the extension to the saucer. And also, I think the area behind the bridge is done up a little bit differently. Let me see here. Yeah, it doesn't have the kind of cut back. It's just straight back there. So definitely a different saucer too. But its main feature is its pod is a weapons pod. This is said to contain additional phasers, additional photons and photon launcher, and probably additional power source and supplies and what have you. So this is the combat variant of the Nebula, or it's a medium cruiser. Kind of neat. So I guess we could consider the first, with the 4 nacelles, to be more of an engineering or scout nebula. We consider the middle one to be a sensor, science, or AWACS nebula, and this would definitely be a combat, defensive, or otherwise patrol nebula. And obviously its role in any kind of game would be that, adding extra armament to it, and all that good stuff. And they were still building these through the Dominion War. So this is a modern ship in this era here, for sure. And it was built to complement the big end of the fleet. And now we come to the Galaxy class. Of course, this was the first edition from Eaglemoss, and is pretty much going to be the first edition for any collection doing Star Trek ships. It's possibly even more recognizable than the original at this point. And it's, of course, the Hilton in space, rightfully so. It's quite ridiculously big, at nearly 650 meters long, and pretty much just as wide, 42 decks, but only a crew of a little over 1,000. It's a lot of space. And you can argue, a good bit's taken up by the 3 shuttle bays, and we see lots of different types of shuttles on board. It also has lots of cargo bays and guest quarters and sensors and all that. Well, all true and fair. Also, it'll have to have redundant systems because of the whole saucer separation thing. So 2 bridges and possibly, 2 medical bays would be a thing. So that would take up some. But still yet, a lot of space on this. This is considered a heavy cruiser, but it is far from combat oriented. While it has powerful phasers, really only has 2 photon launchers, one in the front, one in the back. And it's mostly geared towards science and cargo and support logistics. It is a deep space explorer, and in its time and era, it's one of the fastest ships. It can get up to warp 9.3, at least for a limited time, and cruise at warp 9 for a decent amount of time. And it has this has lots of facilities for everything, but it's frankly too cushy. It seems like after the Cardassian Wars, with the Klingons being allies, with the Romulans being quiet, and with the Borg and Dominion far from being met, yeah, Starfleet was very complacent. They wanted to go back to their exploration roots, and they went way too far. In a game, this would be a very expensive craft in terms of crew, resources, And many times over, we've seen it as a glass cannon. And by that I mean it's easily destroyed by a critical hit, usually to the engineering hull, be it clipping another ship or getting hit by a photon with the shields down. Yeah, it just isn't that durable, and there seems to be most problems related to the warp core because, yeah, that's the #1 emergency. So it's a grand statement of construction, but not necessarily all that great of a ship, frankly. In universe, the Enterprise is the second of the type, with the Galaxy the first. The Yamato is second. Originally, they planned to build 12, much like the original 12 Constitutions. Although, later on in the 2370s, we would see them building more, at least variants of this. But yeah, it's a good show of force. It's very capable. You can send it out to deep space. It can operate on its own for years. It's got large power reserves, but it was a little maybe too ambitious, and they didn't really think about combat as much. So in a game, this would be kind of the overpriced ship that probably wasn't really worth it, frankly. Interesting thing too is the original Armada didn't have a Galaxy as a buildable craft. It was in the game, but it wasn't buildable. Armada 2 fixed that, and the main feature of this ship in the game was the saucer separation, which really, yeah, the whole concept behind that's a little odd, frankly. But this is, of course, the base model that most of the rest on this table are based on, except for maybe the Ambassador and the Ambassador prototype to some extent. But it's kind of the culmination of this lineage that started back in the, early mid-24th century. And unfortunately, right as these were going into space, new threats were encountered, and several were lost pretty early on in their service. The Yamato was lost only after a couple of years, and even the Enterprise herself was lost after only 8 years, which is practically still brand new for a naval vessel. And we also know the Odyssey was lost after only a decade of service, or less. Kind of mirroring their Constitution forebearers there in a way. A lot of those were lost as well. But it is certainly iconic. And they would upgrade it. And our final one, the so-called Galaxy X. Now this one here is actually in the Mirror Universe livery, because the Enterprise D Galaxy X was a subscriber gift that I didn't get. I think they might have re-released it finally now, but this one works. And this was done for all good things, to show the Enterprise as it would have existed at the end of the 24th century. But actually some of its features were carried over to Deep Space Nine in the Dominion War. This is definitely an Enterprise, a Galaxy retrofit for combat. The third nacelle is added, which probably keeps it from saucer separating, which again was kind of a limited use thing anyway. We know that it was capable of warp 13, which we can translate to transwarp, headcanon at least. We've added these cool fins, because why wouldn't you? And we have this big cannon on the bottom, called a phaser lance. We have these things on the saucer, which I think some call sensors. They're phaser cannons. I don't care what they say. They've also expanded the bridge, giving it extra modules, extra stuff. In the real world, they just added stuff to the Galaxy model so they could have something different but also removable. Although one fun thing for Deep Space Nine, they left the additional phaser strips on the nacelles here. And this is what we often refer to as the Galaxy Combat refit. So during the Dominion War, they still would use Galaxies, but they would refit them with more phasers, stronger shields, better hull armor, and hopefully take the kids off. Unless they were annoying. That's what they do with the annoying kids, leave them on board. So in a video game, this would be the actual battleship variant of the Galaxy with an actual punch. And one would hope they would fix the warp core issues. It would seem to be so, because in all good things, this one holds in longer than the earlier ones. So stronger shields and all that too. Kind of reminds me of how Japan had its World War I battleships and how they rebuilt them and gave them more armament, bigger guns for World War II, like the Congos, for example. They also made the Congos faster, so yeah, this is kind of like the World War II Congo refit, but for the Galaxy, which makes sense. This was such a resource-intensive vessel to build. If they're still around, you're not going to scrap them. That said, the one thing, the nacelle in the back, I don't mind. I think the third nacelle is neat, but I would have put it on the bottom, like on the Niagara. That'll look better, and the problem with the nacelle on the back here, it's in the way of your impulse engine, and it's in the way of pretty much all of your shuttle bays. So it just seems like it's more in the way, but since it does cover up the star drive's impulse, that's why I say it's probably not separable. So I think they missed a trick there. Should have put it on the bottom, but of course in the real world they put it on the top, so it was easily just distinguished. And this is another love it or hate it. I mostly like it, but yeah, I don't love it. I think it's a little bit gaudy and gadgety, but oh well. In a game it would actually be the good battleship for this era. And it goes really well with the later Nebula with the weapons pod, showing that these ships, kind of originally made for exploration and science, were partially reworked into warships, at least partially again. But yep, it's neat. It's a good size too. So what'd you think of this video? The idea anyway. Well, let me know what you thought about this. Might do some other kind of, I don't know, just informal things, revisiting, just for fun, hanging out. You know, some of these are pretty standard. The Ambassador and the Galaxy, of course, and even the Nebula. We've seen in other collections. But the Nebula, I don't think we've ever had 3 variants before, which is nearly all of them. I think there's a couple of others, including the CGI variant, but I'm not sure if that really counts. We definitely don't see the Probert concept much. And the Wolf 359 ships, we definitely don't see. Some people have done mock-ups, recreations using parts kits and model kits and things, but this is the first time I think a lot of these have been actually mass-produced, which is just neat. And some of them might look a little derpy, but keep in mind, this was before CGI. This was in the days of models, and not models on a movie budget, but models on a TV budget, and models that were just kind of background for a graveyard scene. They probably could have just taken bits and pieces of broken everything and thrown them on the screen and no one would have cared, but they actually did some effort, and that really expanded the fleet. And this is really the first time we saw that. I mean, in the original series, it was just the Constitution. In the movies, it was the Constitution, the Miranda, and then we got the Oberth and the Excelsior, which kind of made their little fleet. But for a long time, it just stopped there. For the first season of Next Generation, it just stopped there. It wasn't really until Season 3 we kind of got this modern fleet, including the Ambassador. About the only other new ship we had in Season 1 was the Constellation, which was a Constitution kind of flavored kit bash. So, I don't know. So I guess that's why I started. This is when the Star Fleet really started to feel like a multi-tier fleet with ships built for different roles, not just a one-size-fits-all starship that we kind of felt before. So let me know what you think. And with that, I'm gonna go have lunch and let you go. Appreciate you tuning in. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.